Only you would end up married to something you have to keep in a chair.
Only you, she told the girl, would end up married to something you have to keep in a chair.
Couldn't even land a whole man, could you? Even now.
The crippled, ugly recluse the whole city called a monster. The one they had sold this girl to, like a piece of furniture, just to clear a debt. And then the far door opened. He did not come through it in a chair. He walked, slowly on his own two legs, one hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy, and the face they had all been promised was hideous, scarred, ruined. Was not hideous at all. It was the face of a man. Handsome, calm, and absolutely furious. The room went silent, and the smile slid right off her face. Because in that single moment, every one of them understood they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. But to understand how a girl her own family threw in the trash ended up standing in that mansion, how a so-called monster rose up out of that wheelchair, you have to go back. Back to a gray Wednesday morning, and a gate everyone swore led to a nightmare. So stay with me. Because what happened behind that gate was not luck, and it was not a fairy tale. It was what happens when one person decides to look at another human being with their eyes fully open. And, by the end, I promise, you will never look at a stranger the same way again. Her name was Nora Bennett, 24 years old, from a quiet suburb outside Charleston, South Carolina. She did not post pictures of herself online, not because she couldn't, but because when she was 19 she tried once, and the first comment under the photo came from her own stepsister. It said, "Why would you put this out there?" She deleted the picture. She deleted the account. And from that day on, Nora learned a very particular skill. She learned how to take up as little space in the world as possible. Her mother had died when Nora was 17, cancer, the fast kind, the kind that empties a house in a season. And her stepfather, a man named Roger Kane, did what a lot of grieving men do. He started over, faster than he should have. 10 months later, he married a woman named Diane, and Diane came with 2 daughters of her own, Brooke, the older one, and Chelsea, the younger. Beautiful, loud, certain of their place in every room they entered. And here is the thing about Diane. She's not the wicked stepmother from the storybooks. She never locked Nora in an attic. She never raised her voice. What she did was quieter and, honestly, far crueler. She simply looked straight through the girl. Every day for years, she looked at Nora the way you look at a piece of furniture, useful, but not interesting, not worth a second glance. Nora cooked the dinners nobody thanked her for. She sat up all night when Chelsea had a fever, and no one remembered it in the morning. She wrote the college essay that got Brooke into her program. And Brooke never once said the words thank you. Nora was the engine that kept that house running, and she had been running for years without a single person stopping to ask if she was tired. Roger's business collapsed in the spring. He had borrowed heavily, gambled it on a deal that fell apart, and the debt he was left holding was enormous, 6 figures deep. And the man he owed it to was a name that made people in Charleston lower their voices. Julian Vance. If you lived anywhere near that city, you had heard the whispers. Julian Vance had money, old money, some of it, and a great deal more that he had made himself in his 20s before he vanished from public life. But the whispers were not about his money. They were about his face. They said there had been an accident. They said he was hideous now, scarred beyond recognition, that he sat in a wheelchair in a crumbling estate at the edge of the marsh and refused to let anyone see him. They said he was cruel, miserly, that he lent money not to help people, but to trap them. The children in that part of the county dared each other to touch his gate. So when the lawyer came to Roger Kane's door with a proposal, the family did not gather in grief. They gathered like a war council. Julian Vance, the letter said, was not looking for repayment. He was looking for a wife, a companion, someone honest, someone steady, someone who could bring a little warmth back into a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. And in exchange, the debt, all of it, would simply disappear. Diane read the letter 4 times, once to understand it, once to believe it, once to calculate, and once to plan. She called Brooke and glanced at his buddy. She called in Chelsea into the living room and laid it out like a general briefing troops. And I want you to notice what happened next, because this is the moment the whole story turns. Neither girl volunteered. Brooke wrinkled her nose. Marry the monster? Chelsea actually laughed. And then Diane said the words out loud, the words she had already decided the moment she finished reading. She said, "We send Nora." Because who else, she said, would waste Nora on? Let the plain one go clear our debt. Let the girl who's good for nothing else finally be good for something. And Nora heard every word. She was standing 5 steps away, in the hall, folding the same towel she had been folding for 4 minutes. Because no one had noticed she was in the room. They never did. That night she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and did not cry. She had stopped crying in that house a long time ago. Crying requires a witness who cares, and there were none of those here. She looked at the one photograph she had of her mother, laughing at something just outside the frame, so alive it hurt to look at. And Nora made a quiet decision. The kind of decision no one would ever see, because no one ever saw anything she did. She would go, but she would not go as a sacrifice, and she would not go as a joke. She would go as herself, whatever was left of that after all these years. Man glanced at his buddy, and if the man behind the gate turned her away, then at least something real would have been rejected, instead of the frightened little ghost this family had tried to turn her into. The car came on a Wednesday morning. Gray sky whined off the water, carrying the smell of salt and pluff mud. The gate to the Vance estate was tall and black and perfectly still, the kind of gate that had been standing there long before anyone arrived, and would still be standing long after they left. Nora breathed in. She breathed out. The gate opened. Now Julian Vance was not supposed to be the one waiting for her. His housekeeper was meant to receive the guest, offer tea, and inform him she had arrived. That was the system. The first man glanced at his buddy. That was how the 2 previous introductions had gone, both of them ending in under 40 minutes, when the women got their first look at his face and remembered somewhere they suddenly needed to be. The first man glanced at his buddy. But something pulled Julian out of his study that morning. He couldn't have told you what. He rolled himself down the long hall and out onto the stone terrace, and there he was at the far end of the path when the gate opened, and she stepped through. And for 3 full seconds, before she knew anyone was watching, Julian saw something on Nora's face that stopped him cold. She was not performing. She was looking at the overgrown garden, at the wild roses that had climbed halfway up the old fountain, and she was looking at it the way a person looks at something beautiful after going a very long time without seeing anything beautiful at all. Not with hunger, with a kind of grief, like all that beauty almost hurt because she had gone so long without any. Then she turned and she saw him. Here is what she saw. A man in a wheelchair, his face, half of it, a ruin of scar tissue, twisted and raw, one eye pulled down at the corner, hair grown long and unkempt. An old flannel shirt worn at the cuffs. He looked exactly like the monster the whole city promised he would be. And Nora did not flinch. She did not paste on a bright, terrified smile. She did not look away the way the others had. She just held his eyes steady, the way you hold the eyes of another person and not a spectacle. Julian rolled forward. No housekeeper. No ceremony. He stopped the chair 2 feet in front of her and said, "You must be Nora." She said, "Yes, just yes. No title, no performance." He said, "Most people can't hold my gaze this long. You're doing better than a boardroom full of men who wanted my money." And Nora said, "I'm not looking at your scars, Mr. Vance. I'm looking at whether you're going to lie to me. Everyone in my life lies to me while smiling. I'd rather know now." Something moved behind his ruined face. He said, "Then let's both agree not to smile." They talked in that garden for an hour. He asked her, "How honest are you willing to be? About why you're really here, about what your family wants, about whether any part of this was your idea." And Nora stopped walking beside his chair, and she turned and she told him the truth. She said, "My stepmother is sending me to clear a debt. Nobody else would take the assignment. I'm the one they thought was worth the least. That's why I'm standing here." She lifted her chin. "That's the truth. I don't have anything else to give you." And Julian Vance, a man whose name moved money across an entire state, looked down at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked up at her with an expression Nora had never once had aimed at her in her whole life. He looked at her like she had just handed him something rare. "Now I have to tell you about the boy. There was a child in that house. His name was Theo, and he was 9 years old. He was the son of Julian's driver, a man named Marcus who, on the night of the accident that took Julian's legs, had thrown his own body between Julian and the wreck. Marcus died, Julian lived, and Julian, drowning in a guilt he could not put down, took the boy in. But guilt is not the same thing as knowing how to love a child. Julian gave Theo everything money could buy, and none of the things it couldn't. And since the day his father died, Theo had not spoken a single word. Not to Julian, not to the staff, not to anyone. He moved through that big house like a small shadow, always in the far corners, always with a sketchbook clutched to his chest. Nora noticed him on her third day. She didn't chase him. She didn't crouch down and ask him 100 bright questions the way adults do when they meet a hurting child and feel the itch to fix it. She just noticed the sketchbook, and that night she tore a page from a notepad and she drew something simple, a little bird on a branch, and she slid it under Theo's door. The next morning it was still there, untouched. She didn't say a word about it. That night she drew a tree, slid it under the door. The morning after, nothing. A week went by like that, a drawing every night. A bird, a boat on the water, a house with a crooked chimney. She never mentioned them. She never asked if he'd seen them. And then, on the 10th morning, Nora found a folded piece of paper under her own door. She opened it. It was a drawing, rough, done in a child's hand. It was a picture of a girl with brown hair holding the hand of a small boy. Theo had answered. Julian happened to be in the hall when Nora knelt down and picked up that paper. He watched her, read it. He watched her press it flat against her chest and close her eyes. And he watched, from the door of his study as later that day Theo, for the first time in over a year, walked up to a person on his own and tugged gently at the hem of Nora's sweater and held up his sketchbook to show her. Julian rolled back into his study and shut the door and sat in the dark for a long time, because he had just watched a woman with nothing, a woman his own city had thrown away like garbage, do the one thing his enormous fortune had never been able to buy. She reached the boy. Now here is the secret, the one nobody in the story knew. The scars were fake. I need you to understand what I mean. The accident was real. Marcus was real. The legs, the wheelchair, that was all painfully, permanently real. Julian Vance could not walk, and the doctors had told him he likely never would again. But his face was untouched. Underneath the twisted scar tissue was makeup. A slow, careful application he did every morning, prosthetic and paint, the work of a man who had once, long ago, in another life, spent time on film sets and knew exactly how it was done. And on the mornings he did not want visitors, he wore it thick. He did it after his wife died. Her name had been Claire, and she had died the same year the accident took his legs, and in his grief Julian had built himself a test. He decided he would never again let anyone close to him who wanted only his money or his name. So he made himself repulsive. He let the rumors grow, and he watched. He watched every person who came through that gate turn pale and leave, and each time one of them fled, it confirmed the thing he already believed, that no one, not one single person on this earth, would choose him if there was nothing beautiful to look at. Nora found out on a rainy night, 3 weeks in. She had come to bring him tea and found the study door open. He was at the mirror, and the makeup was half gone, a cloth in his hand, one side of his face already wiped clean. And what she saw underneath was not a monster. It was a man, a tired, handsome, hollowed-out man of 50, with kind eyes and a mouth that had forgotten how to rest. He froze when he saw her in the mirror, and Nora did not gasp. She did not laugh. She stood in the doorway and she said one thing very quietly, and it went into him like a key into a lock he'd forgotten he had. She said, "You hide your face because you're afraid people will only love the outside of you. But you've been hiding so long that you've made sure nobody can love the real you either." She set down the tea. "You didn't build a test, Mr. Vance. You built a cage." Julian Vance did not say anything for a long time. And then, for the first time in years, he let another human being watch him wipe the last of the mask away. After that, something changed in the house. Nora found the room at the end of the West Wing, a physical therapy room, full of equipment, all of it draped in white sheets and coated in dust, parallel bars, a padded table, a wall of medals from another life, when Julian Vance had been a man who ran marathons. She didn't offer him pity. Pity was the one thing she had never been given, so it was the one thing she refused to hand out. Instead, she stood in the doorway of that room and she said, "You stopped trying to stand up because standing up means you have to stay. It means you have to keep living without her. And that scares you more than the falling does." Julian said, "The doctors said it's a waste of time." Nora said, "So was I. Everyone said so." And that was how it started. Every morning before the sun, the three of them went to that room. Nora on one side, small silent Theo on the other, holding the bar steady with his little hands. Julian gripping the rails, sweat pouring, legs shaking, falling and falling and falling. And every time he went down, Theo would be there, this 9-year-old boy who had lost his father, planting his feet and refusing to let the man tip over. 3 broken people, learning to hold each other up. It took months. There were mornings Julian cursed and threw the towel and said he was done. And Nora would just sit on the floor beside his chair and wait, and eventually he'd grip the bars again. Slowly, impossibly, the legs began to remember. A step, then 2, then the length of the bars. And somewhere in all those gray mornings, something else grew that none of them planned. Julian would find himself, at the end of a long day, thinking not about his companies, but about the sound of Nora's laugh. Nora would catch herself smiling for no reason at all. And Theo started leaving drawings for both of them. Pictures of 3 people, always 3. Then the news got out that Julian Vance was not poor. I don't know how these things travel, but they do. Word reached Diane Kane that the ruined recluse behind the marsh gate was, in fact, one of the wealthiest men in the state, and that the plain stepdaughter she had thrown away to clear a debt was now living in that estate as his soon-to-be wife. And Diane came back. She brought Roger and Brooke and Chelsea, and she brought that particular kind of confidence that people have when they've never once been told no. They came up the long drive on a Saturday afternoon, and Diane glanced at his buddy. And Diane rang the bell and when the door opened, she pushed right past the housekeeper into the great room, already talking. She said, "Nora, sweetheart, we've been so worried. We couldn't just leave you out here alone with." She waved a hand vaguely with him. "And now that we understand the situation a little better, we think it's only fair, as your family, that we're part of this new chapter. We raised you, after all. We're owed something for that." Brooke was already looking at the chandeliers. Chelsea was running a finger along a marble table. Roger stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and something in his face. "I want you to remember this." Something in Roger's face was not greedy. It was ashamed. Diane turned to Nora, and she smiled, and it was a cruel smile, and she said, "Though I have to say, dear, only you would end up married to something you have to keep in a chair. Couldn't even land a whole man, could you? Even now." And that is when the far door opened. Julian Vance came through it. But he did not come through it in a chair. He walked, slowly, carefully, one hand resting light on Theo's shoulder. Not for support, but because the boy wanted to walk beside him. Julian Vance crossed that great room on his own 2 legs. And his face, his real face, The handsome, unhidden face he had kept locked away from the world for years was set and calm and terrible in its dignity. The room went utterly silent. Diane's mouth opened and nothing came out. Brooke's hand dropped from the chandelier. Chelsea backed into the marble table. Julian stopped in front of them. He did not raise his voice. He said, "You're right about one thing, Mrs. Kane. There was a debt in this house, and it has just been paid in full, but not the one you're thinking of." He nodded toward the door, where a man in a suit had quietly entered behind them. "My attorney," Julian said, "has spent the last several weeks reviewing the circumstances of your original loan. It turns out the money Roger borrowed, the money he lost, a significant portion of it was never his to gamble. It was drawn from an account held in trust. Nora's account, the inheritance her mother left her, diverted quietly the year after she died." Roger's face went white. Because it was true, and he had known it was true every single day he let his wife treat that girl like a servant in her own home. "You didn't sell me a stranger to clear your debt," Julian said, and his voice was quiet, as still water. "You sold me the very person you had already robbed. And now the state's attorney would like to have a conversation with you about where that trust money went." Diane's smile was gone. In its place was the face of someone watching the floor open beneath her. She had come to take a share of a fortune. She was leaving as the subject of an investigation. But that was not the punishment. Not the real one. The real one came next. Julian turned to Nora, and in front of all of them, he took her hand, and he said, loud enough for every one of them to hear, "I spent years believing no one would ever choose me if there was nothing beautiful left to look at. And then a woman your family threw in the trash walked through my gate and chose the ugliest version of me before she ever saw my face or knew my worth. So let me be very clear about what you gave away. You didn't throw away a burden. You threw away the best person any of you will ever meet." And Diane Kane, for the first time in her life, had nothing to say. She stood in that beautiful room and she finally understood, all at once, the size of what she had done. She turned to leave, and at the door she stopped, and she looked back at Nora, and her voice cracked when she said, "I'm sorry, I never..." She couldn't finish, but it was the first true thing she had ever said to the girl. It was Roger who came back a week later, alone, no lawyer, no wife. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and he told Nora the truth, all of it, the money, the years, the silence. He didn't ask to be forgiven. He said, "I let it happen because it was easier than being brave. And your mother would be ashamed of me." He returned every dollar he could, sold his own house to do it, and he faced the charges without hiding. It didn't undo anything. But it was the first time in his life Roger Kane had chosen the hard, honest thing over the easy, quiet one. Diane and her daughters were left with the wreckage of the life they'd built on other people's backs, and they scattered. Sometimes that is exactly how the story ends for people like them. Not with a bang, with an empty room and the sound of their own choices catching up. The wedding was on a Wednesday, not a weekend, not a date circled on any calendar, just an ordinary morning with a soft gray sky and the smell of salt on the wind. There was no crowd, there were no cameras. There was Nora in a plain yellow dress she had bought years ago, because the first time she put it on she felt, for one moment, like herself. There was the housekeeper crying before it even started, and there was Julian Vance standing at the end of a short garden path, no chair, no mask, no scars, no fortune on display, just a man on his own. 2 legs, waiting for the woman who had seen him when he was the least lovable version of himself. He walked to her, every step his own, and when he reached her he did not make a speech. He just held both her hands. And then a small voice, cracked from a year of silence, said one word. Theo, standing beside them in his little jacket, looked up at the two of them, and he said, "Mom." And then he looked at Julian, and he said, "Dad." Nora dropped to her knees and pulled the boy in, and the 3 of them held on to each other on that garden path, while the marsh birds called and the whole ordinary, beautiful world went on around them. not knowing and not caring what had just happened. A family made not out of blood, but out of the simple, radical act of choosing to see one another. Now I want to talk to you, not about the story, about you. The people who never saw Nora were not monsters. That's the part I need you to carry with you. They were ordinary, and ordinary people, too busy performing their own lives to notice yours, can do just as much damage as any villain. It leaves the same silence inside a person. And if you recognized yourself in Nora today, if you have learned how to disappear even in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, then I need you to hear this one thing before you go. The fact that they didn't see you does not mean you were not worth seeing. It means they were looking in the wrong direction. And someday, on some ordinary gray Wednesday, in a world full of noise, the right person is going to look up, and they are going to see all of you, the parts you hide. The parts you were told were too much or not enough, every single one. So don't wipe yourself away before they get the chance.